Few countries in the modern era have been shaped by or subject to the horrors of war as much as Poland. From its emergence after the First World War in 1918 until 20 years later, it found itself again subject to occupation. The army has played a key role in Poland's history and development. In this series of films, we look at that time, the emergence of a new army in 1918, its first major conflict in the Polish-Soviet War, its attempts during the 1930s to maintain development faced with a European-wide arms race and the struggle of the Second World War. This is a story of how the Polish Army and the Navy and the Air Force responded to that challenge. When we talk about the new Polish army and independence, of course, soldiers were drawn from the three partitioning powers, Germany, Russia and Austria. What sort of influences, or how did the Polish Chief of Staff decide on how to create a new army from essentially three different traditions?
Ta armia powstawała nie z trzech części, ale właściwie z pięciu, bo jeszcze musimy pamiętać, że oprócz tych armii zaborczych były też...
This army was formed not from three parts, but actually from five, because we still have to remember that apart from the partitioning armies, there were also Piłsudski legions, which was a volunteer formation that was created during World War II. There was also the Polish army in France, which was founded in 1917. We had at least 5 sources of Polish officers and soldiers, and they tried to develop a common method. After the end of the Polish-Bolshevik War, because we had an alliance with France, as our ally, France wanted to force some things onto us, and at the beginning, the French influence was large. During the French mission in Poland, which helped organize the supreme state authorities, it was an adversary and training mission. The French influence was very strongly manifested. However, but no other experiences were rejected. Above all, the experience of officers, often very high levels. An example is the commander of the Greater Poland Uprising, General Dowbor-Muśnicki, who was a general in the Russian army. He transferred the experiences gained while fighting in the partitioning army to his own land. The army of the Greater Poland Uprising was interesting because it came from the Prussian army, the German army, as most of the soldiers were soldiers of the German army who returned from the front of the First World War and fought for Greater Poland. Marshal Józef Piłsudski, who was self-taught when it comes to military and did not finish any military school, he was a very good strategist. He knew very well the history of wars, Napoleonic Wars. He also knew other war activities, so as a self-taught, he had an influence on the organization and management of war. We can observe this both in the Polish Bolshevik War and later after he took over full power after 1926.
Wojną możemy obserwować zarówno w wojnie polsko-bolszewickiej, jak i później po tym, jak przejął pełnię władzy po roku 1926.
And in the immediate post-war period, did the size of the armed forces grow from the million or so it had for the Soviet-Polish War? I mean, how did the army get bigger?
Oczywiście po zawarciu pokoju ryskiego I ukształtowaniu wschodniej granicy Polski.
Of course, after the conclusion of the Riga Peace and the formation of the eastern border of Poland, the army was reduced to a peaceful state. There were 1 million soldiers in the army during the war, while during peace, the army had about 300,000 soldiers. This was an army which primarily trained and prepared for war. It was an army that consisted of infantry, cavalry, artillery, but also armored weapons, which were tanks, aviation, and a Polish navy, which was stationed on the Polish coast in the newly built city of Gdynia, but also in the second Polish base in the Baltic on Hel.
I drugą bazą polskiej marynarki był Hel na Bałtyku.
In 1933, in Germany, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. He had written in Mein Kampf that he would seek territorial expansion in the east, and immediately in breach of the Versailles Treaty, he started rearming, essentially, and increasing the size of the German armed forces. How did Poland react to this increase of the German armed forces on its border?
Polska w okresie w latach 30.
Poland in the 1930s had a strong army in Europe, but Hitler's rise to power and the creation of the Wehrmacht influenced the Polish military authorities, who tried to modernize the army. After the death of Marshal Piłsudski in 1935, Polish capabilities and the Polish armed forces were evaluated, and the project modernization of the army was created. We studied, through intelligence, how the German army grows, how the Red Army grows, because we should not forget that the Soviet Union and Germany were our two largest neighbors. So Poland tried to modernize its own industry and create our own weapon systems, but also to buy some weapon systems and introduce them in our army, like the anti-tank cannons that were purchased at the Swedish company Bofors. A license to manufacture them was also purchased. In addition, guns modeled on American revolvers were introduced into the armament of the Polish army, and UR anti-tank rifles were introduced, which were an innovative solution, a weapon that was a secret weapon before the outbreak of World War II, which could destroy any German or Soviet tank in 1939. Its armament potential was modernized on a large scale. Tanks were also produced in Warsaw at the Ursus factory, 7 TP light tanks. Various types of planes were built. Wash bombers, medium bombers, twin-engine bombers were put into service. Although there were only few of them, this showed that the Polish arms industry, although built from scratch, was at a world-class level and was able to produce combat equipment and tools that did not differ in their class from solutions used in other countries. The Polish problem was primarily the amount of weapons. Unfortunately, the state was poor and backwards after regaining independence. After 130 years of captivity, it was necessary to merge those three parts that created one country and tried to develop their own industry, factories. It is also worth mentioning of the investment of the late 30s Central Industrial District, which was created in the Security Triangle and new industrial plants in the forks of the Vistula and San rivers. For example, a factory in Rzeszów where anti-grav guns and many other factories were manufactured, or in Stalowa Wola, where a large steel mill was built, or other southern plants.
Rozpoczęto budowę też nowych miast, jak chociażby Stalowej Woli, gdzie wybudowano dużą hutę, tak zwane zakłady południowe, gdzie produkowano chociażby haubice dla potrzeb armii.
So one of the challenges then essentially was keeping up with the quantity of new equipment needed in the face of a time in Europe when, certainly towards the end of the 1930s, there was this massive increase in re-equipping of armies.
Polacy produkowali sprzęt na własne potrzeby, starali się też sprzęt stary.
Poles produced equipment for their own needs. They also tried to export old equipment that was worn out in order to raise funds to introduce new constructions and improve their own arms industry. Poland, in the interwar period, took part in the sale of weapons to Spain, where the civil war lasted from 1936, and the old equipment that came from the supplies of the First World War was sold out, and efforts were made to supplement it using its own production to the best of its ability. Before the outbreak of World War II, attempts were made to buy equipment from our allies in France and Great Britain, but unfortunately these purchases and their production had little effect on the armament of the Polish army in 1939, because only 50 tanks were brought to the outbreak of the war. Only one battalion was created.
50 czołgów, które powstały, jeden batalion z nich.
One of the great advantages we had during the Second World War on the Allied side was, of course, the availability of intelligence from having cracked the Enigma code, something, of course, we're very proud of in the United Kingdom, the work of Alan Turing, but of course that work was based very much on the work of Polish decoders. And I was wondering how initially the Polish decoders were able to get hold of the Enigma machine and begin their decoding work.
Polacy, wywiad polski, biuro szyfrów polskiego wywiadu w latach 20. wiedziało, że Niemcy...
The Polish Intelligence Cipher Bureau in the 1920s knew that Germany was using cipher machines and chose young mathematicians from Poznań and taught them how to code. These mathematicians were employed in the cipher office. Because the ciphers were sent by radio, anyone could pick them up. They tried to break the German coding method using the Enigma machine, and they succeeded at the end of 1932. Marian Rejewski managed to break the German coding method. Thanks to mathematical analysis, he deciphered German reports. The principles of the machine's operation were learned due to the fact that a similar machine operating on a similar principle found itself in the hands of the Polish intelligence. These machines, based on this design, were also used commercially, so they were available on the market. Similar machines could be purchased. In cooperation with our cryptologists, this machine was broken, and alongside its coding method.
Tę maszynę złamać sposób kodowania.
In these programs we've seen how Poland, from its emergence in 1918, after 123 years of partition, has, as a state, had to fight for its place in Europe. The army and the other services have constantly grappled with the need for new technology against an ever-changing European political and military background. This fight for technology is one thing, but in Poland there was also a fight, a real fight, against real enemies. And despite their material defects, of never quite being ready, of never quite having enough equipment, the Polish military spirit was undimmed. This was clearest of all in the Second World War, when Poland contributed to two particular events, the Battle at Monte Cassino and the contribution to the Battle of Britain. Those just two out of every major theatre in which the Polish army took part. This has been a fascinating story of an undimmed military spirit fighting against all the odds. A great story. I'm Nicholas Richardson, and join me again on Poland Daily History when we delve into some more exciting aspects of Poland's history.